Good evening. Good evening. We have a few more people being seated. I'm going to go ahead and get started with my introductory remarks. My name is Ken Coopwood. I'm the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion here at Missouri State University. It is my pleasure to welcome members of our community, the community of Springfield, and those of you who are still in attendance for the inaugural statewide collaborative diversity conference. It's been a good conference so far, wouldn't you say? It is certainly my pleasure to be a part of this great opportunity to bring the likes of Tim Wise to campus and to bring the general knowledge and insight and sharing and energy that only a collaborative conference can bring. So I want to thank you again for hanging in there all day and staying in the spirit of learning for the sake of a diverse and just society. With that, I'm going to introduce our main event. This gentleman is one of the country's leading anti-racist writers and activists. Tim Wise is among the most prominent writers and educators in the entire United States. He was named one of 25 visionaries who are changing our world. He has spoken in all 50 states and at over 800 colleges and high school campuses and to community groups across the nation. He has provided anti-racism training to teachers nationwide and has conducted trainings with physicians and medical industry professionals on how to combat racial inequities in healthcare. He has trained corporate, government, entertainment, military, and law enforcement officials on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions, and has served as a consultant for plaintiffs, attorneys, in federal discrimination cases in New York and Washington State. Tim Wise graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. He has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs. He is a regular contributor to discussions on race on CNN and has been featured on ABC's 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to tell you about a person who I know to personally be very factual about his convictions and his commitment to dismantling racism. I've had the privilege of being with him at previous times in my career where he addressed the city of Gary, and he has addressed the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity about as many times as I've attended that conference, and that's about 17. Everyone needs a dose of Tim Wise, is what people say all around the country. And tonight, here in Springfield, I ask you to prepare for good medicine and wellness in race relations. Please help me welcome the courage and the competency of Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here and to see a wonderful crowd that I can assume by looking out, because it's a conference and You've been heavily encouraged to attend, but it's not an audience that was bribed with the promise of extra credit to be here, which is always good. I don't see any buffet, so they didn't bribe you with food. Like, you actually made the decision to come because for whatever reason, and you may have your own reasons, far different than mine, and we may have a couple hundred different reasons in the room, but for whatever reason, you believe that this conversation about racial equity, about gender equity, about economic equity, generally all the things that we talk about when we talk about social justice, economic justice, diversity, all these terms that we throw out, that's an important conversation. And so I'm glad that you're here. I hope that you're enjoying the conference so far, and I hope that you will continue to do so tomorrow. And I hope, but I cannot promise, that you will enjoy the things that I have to say to you this evening, because I am not known for spending a whole lot of time worrying about how people are going to respond to my remarks. It's not that I don't care. That would be untrue. As an activist and an educator, I obviously worry about the pedagogical effect, the strategic effect of my words. At the same time, however, I have learned after 23 years of doing anti-racism work of one form or another that there are an awful lot of times when no matter what you say about this subject and no matter how you say it, there will be those who, for their own reasons, and again, I can only speculate as to what those might be, do not want to hear it or not prepared to hear it and are not going to have a very good time hearing it. And so I assume that is possible, even for those who have come to a conference on diversity and who are here for that reason. And so I will simply say to you that as you've been warned or told that everyone needs a dose of Tim Wise, some may feel after the evening that you have overdosed on Tim Wise. And you may seek an antidote for that at your nearest hospital. It is especially good to be here because I do know, and I joke about it, but I do realize that in many ways, this conversation about race and racial equity in particular is not one that people gravitate to automatically because it is fun. No one really likes to have this conversation. And I'm not saying that just from my own 23 years of experience. I'm saying it based on what the social science research actually tells us. The research has actually been done on this, and it finds that neither people of color nor white folks really enjoy having discussions about race and racism and racial discrimination or inequality, and that's for different reasons, but both of those reasons are worth exploring. So for people of color, for instance, what the research tells us is that for black and brown folk, they really don't like talking about this with white people in the room. Surprise, surprise, right? Shocking. Folks of color don't really like talking about race with white folks around. Why? Well, according to the research, it's because they have enough experience after years of living that tells them that when they raise these issues, even if it is only to express their own lived experience with racism and discrimination and inequality, that too oftentimes large numbers of us, those of us who are white, not all of us, but large numbers of us, oftentimes the overwhelming majority, will shut down around that conversation, will, in a sense, minimize their concerns, marginalize their narrative of their own life, for God's sake. Maybe even retaliate against them professionally or educationally for bringing up the issues. And so in a sense, people of color have learned over a lifetime that sometimes it's easier to just shut down, you know? It's easier to just not talk about it at all rather than being accused of exaggerating or making a mountain out of a molehill or playing the race card, which is a nice and tidy phrase that white folks came up with 10 or 15 years ago when we decided we'd rather not deal with the reality that other people live, you see. So we'd rather just put it off to exaggeration, seeing things, playing a race card, which, by the way, if you don't learn anything else from this conference, learn at least this. If we actually are going to claim that race is a card, we ought to at least be honest about which card that is. I don't know how many of you play poker, but I can assure you that if race is actually a card, it has all the weight and power of the two of diamonds, which is to say not much. Right? That is a pretty weak card. It doesn't actually win any hand in any game that you're playing. Right? So the idea that people of color would exaggerate the problem of racism so as to somehow get somewhere in larger society or win an argument with those of us who are white doesn't make a lot of sense when you realize that every time people of color bring it up, even when it's completely valid and legitimate, they get shut down. They get ignored. They get accused of exaggerating. So it's very obviously the case, and the research tells us, that people of color not only don't exaggerate the problem, if anything, they minimize the problem in their conversations with us for fear that no matter how true the allegation is and no matter how real the problem is, that we aren't prepared to hear it. Now, for white folks, the research says we have a fear as well that keeps us from wanting to talk about race around people of color. It's not the same fear that people of color have. It's not the one about being marginalized or having our beliefs minimized, let alone being retaliated against. That's not what we're concerned about, according to the research. According to the research, what we're worried about is that, oh my God, if we talk about race and people of color are in the room, we're gonna make a mistake, we're gonna say something stupid, we're gonna screw up, and then they might think we're racist because we're gonna say the wrong thing. Now, what's interesting about this is that the presumption that somehow a lot of whites apparently have, according to the research, that says that if we talk about race, that's when we're going to make people of color think that we're racist. The irony of that is the research actually tells us that people of color already assume that we probably are. Whether or not we talk, like opening our mouth is not the thing that makes people of color assume that we might be racist. What makes them assume that we might be racist is that we live in the United States of America, a country in which we have been conditioned from birth, generation in and generation out, to have certain racial assumptions and stereotypes. People of color are not being particularly judgmental or harsh when they make this assumption. They're just saying, for God's sake, you grew up here, we grew up here, we internalized some of this nonsense against ourselves, so we pretty much assume that you did too. That's all folks of color are saying. Right, is that if you grow up in a society where race and racism and racial prejudices and stereotypes have been embedded in the very fabric of the community, what are the odds that you escaped that? People of color would tell you the odds are zero, right? So the idea that we're going to keep our mouths shut and somehow keep people of color from thinking we have racial bias is sort of a fool's errand, because they've already started out with the assumption that, probably that's part of our character. And interestingly, there's a whole third body of research which comes out of Northwestern University in Chicago a couple years back, which finds that, interestingly enough, and again ironically, it is precisely at the moment when white folks don't want to talk about race and we shut down around it, even though it's the elephant in the room, it's precisely at that moment that we most confirm in the eyes of people of color that the reason we're being quiet is because we have something to hide. Right? So at that very moment when race is the obvious issue and we don't talk about it, black and brown folk look at us and go, yeah, see, I think I know why you're not talking, because I think you're covering up. So if anything, we'd be better off to just take the chance, wouldn't we? We'd be better off to take the risk, make a mistake, as we all will from time to time, oftentimes, many times in the course of a week or a month or a year, the course of our lives. We'd be better off to take the risk, screw up, say something stupid, get called on it, and then pull up our big people pants and try again. But instead, we run away from the conversation like children. It's not doing any good. It doesn't allow us to deal with the problem. But unfortunately, we live in a culture, don't we, in which we're being told that we don't really need to have this conversation around race anymore. People would look at you assembled here for a conference on this, assembled here to hear a talk called Beyond Diversity, Challenging Racism in an Age of Backlash, and they would say, what in the world are you here for? Why would you come to this? Why would you need to? What do you mean, racism in an age of backlash? What do you mean? How could we possibly have a problem with racism, they would ask you. Maybe you have, or others you know have asked you this question, or you've asked it yourself. How could we possibly, they say, have a racism problem? After all, we have a man of color as president. So done, we're done. Let's move on. I get these emails all the time, right? I get these emails, and they all, they're going to be crazy because they're all capital letters, right? And red font. Like I wouldn't have known you were pissed if you took the cap lock off. I'd have had no idea you were angry at me. The death threat, the go kill yourself thing, I would never have figured that out. But the capital letters, that's what made me know that you didn't like me much. I get these emails, they say, well, Tim. I remember I got this one like the day after President Obama was elected the first time, right? The very next morning, woke up, hadn't even had my first cup of coffee. Opened up the computer, and there it was. Well, Tim, oh, God, Looks like you're going to have to get a new hustle, because, that's what this is. It's a hustle. Because I can very distinctly remember being 20 years old, looking in the mirror and saying to myself, now, what is my hustle going to be? And I thought about it for hours, days, weeks, and finally I concluded, because who wouldn't, that my hustle should be fighting white supremacy, because that always works out so well for those who choose that line of work. You're going to have to find a new hustle, aren't you? Because now that President Obama is president, right? Racism is obviously dead, so what are you going to talk about now, you know? And I heard that over and over, and I'm sure you've heard some iteration of it in the course of the last 5 years or so. This idea that the man of color being president somehow suggests that racism has been either eliminated or at least diminished to the point where we really don't need to have conferences about it anymore or talk about it as a serious social problem. I would like for you to process this logic with me for just a second. It won't take long, and then we can move on to more serious matters. To suggest that individual accomplishment on the part of a man of color tells us something about larger systemic truth is by definition irrational. How do we know that? We know it because we can think of other examples that prove it. If I were to tell the women in this room, for instance, that if you really wanted to have equal opportunity in society, you should move to Pakistan, Israel, India, Great Britain, or the Philippines. Why? Because they've all had women as heads of state. We still haven't. I'm imagining that every woman in the room would know that was irrational advice. Right? If I were to tell you what you really ought to do, women, is pack your bags and move to Karachi because there you will have full equal opportunity. Why do I know this? Because Benazir Bhutto, a woman, was elected head of state in Pakistan not once but twice. Now, of course, since she has been assassinated, so that lets you know how much some people loved her. But she did win. We still haven't had a female head of state, but I assume that every woman in the room, I assume my 9-year-old daughter who knows nothing about Pakistan, Israel, India, Great Britain, the Philippines, or any other nation that's had a female head of state, I assume that even she would understand that to believe an individual woman attaining a powerful position somehow suggests that women on the whole are no longer subjected to patriarchal oppression was nonsense. And that's from a 9-year-old who doesn't even know what the words patriarchal oppression even mean. Even she would see through that, right? Because individual accomplishment doesn't tell us anything about institutional truth. That's why, you know, an individual African-American woman, Madam C.J. Walker, could become a millionaire in 1911 selling beauty products to black women that white cosmetics firms didn't feel the need to manufacture, market, and distribute. Madam C.J. Walker became the first African-American millionaire, but that was in 1911, which on balance was not a good year to be black in America. 63 African-American folks lynched that year. The fact that she became a millionaire didn't obviate the fact that we were a racial fascist society at that time. There have always been people, as James Baldwin told us some 45 years ago, there have always been those who in the teeth of the deepest oppression were still able to overcome those obstacles. That tells us nothing about the larger society. And yet people are telling us, well, all right, maybe so, but you know, you still shouldn't talk about this. Because to talk about it just makes the problem worse, right? I get those emails too. Also in capital letters, right? The ones that say, well, it's people like you who are keeping racism alive. If you just wouldn't talk about racism, it would go away. It's people like you who insist on talking about it that keep it going. And again, I would have you process the logic of this with me for just a second. It will not take long. I want you to process the argument with me that somehow when you have a major social problem, that the answer to that is talking about it less. And I would have you ask yourself, is there any other social problem on the face of the earth about which you would say that? Or about which anyone would say that? That yes, there's this problem and the way we're going to solve it is to not talk about it. And if you're having a hard time coming up with another example, I will be happy to give you one. Here it is, world hunger. Let's think about that. If I were to stand up here and tell you this evening, rather than the talk I'm giving you, rather than that, give you a talk about world hunger and say, you know, there are billions of children all around this earth who are starving right now as I speak for lack of adequate nutrition, how many of you would respond by saying, shh, oh my God, fool, don't talk about that. What in the world are you doing? If you talk about hunger, people are going to starve. That's how that works. My God, what kind of fool are you? On the other hand, if you would just stop talking about it, food would miraculously appear on the plates of those children, and they would have enough to eat. My God, what an amazing solution to world hunger. Why didn't we think about that? We could have done that. It's cheap. In fact, it's free. Just stop talking about it, and everybody has enough food. Bono could go back to making music, and the world would be so wonderful. Why haven't we thought about that? Because it's stupid as hell. That's why. It makes no sense whatsoever. You worried about crime? That makes sense. I'm worried about crime. Crime's a problem. I've been held up at gunpoint, had my apartment broken into many years ago, had my car broken into, right? I've been the victim of crime. Shh. God, don't talk about crime. You talk about that, someone's going to get carjacked this evening. You just wouldn't talk about it. We could empty the jails and prisons, fire all the cops. My God, what an amazing answer to the problem of crime. No, it's not. It's ridiculous. Makes no sense, and we wouldn't suggest it about any other problem. But about this problem, we're being counseled that we should speak less. We should be, in effect, color mute, right, which is the verbalization equivalent of colorblind, right? Let's not think about it. Let's not talk about it. Let's not discuss it, because the more we discuss it, the bigger the problem it becomes. See, that is the difference between the way that white folks, by and large, and people of color, by and large, come to this issue of race. Too many of us in the white community believe that we need to talk about it less, notice it less. My God, let's not see color. Let's not think about color. People of color understand that if you don't see color, you don't see the consequences of color, you see. As Julian Bond, civil rights legend, tells us. To be blind to color is to be blind to its consequence. And if you don't understand the consequence of color, all you need to do, and this is particularly pertinent right now, is think about the way in which this country responds to terrorism when it is perpetrated by brown folk as opposed to when it is perpetrated by white folk. Now, I don't know if you've seen the images that have been released in the last 2 hours of the suspected bombers in Boston, but they are not as they were reported to be. You remember yesterday and the day before, it was, dark-skinned male being sought. Yeah, they found 2 dark-skinned males. By dark-skinned, I mean light-skinned, right? Which is to say they did not fit the description, but now there are already 4 or 5 reports circulating in this country, and particularly in Boston, of Arab Americans being attacked because the presumption, right, the consequence of their color and their faith, the combination of those 2 things, or just the presumption of their faith, because hell, you don't know somebody's Muslim by looking at them, right, was that they were responsible naturally, because if it's terrorism, they must be. Now you got these 2, what look to me to be white frat boys, backward baseball caps, you know. Looks like every frat party I ever saw. But we're not going to start profiling them, or as now is the meme on the internet, if y'all haven't seen it, is brofiling. We're not going to start brofiling them. Maybe we should, but we won't, right? Because the consequence of color is when white folks do crazy stuff, it doesn't end up sticking to the rest of us. And I wrote a piece on this 2 days ago, which has gone pretty viral. Some of y'all might have seen it. I listed 50 names of white terrorists going back the last few decades, 50 names, only a few of which you'll even recognize. Yeah, you'll recognize Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. You'll recognize Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols. You recognize Eric Rudolph, maybe the Olympic Park bomber in '96. But the rest of them, odds are pretty good you never heard of any of them. Why? Because we don't talk about them the same way that we do those who commit terrorism with brown skin and a Muslim faith. Right? And so you have 50 examples, and none of it stuck to white folks. I'm not worried that if I wore a baseball cap backward for some strange reason at 44, I mean, it'd be weird. I probably ought to be pulled out and profiled for that. But I'm not worried that if I did that somehow it's going to stick to me. See, people of color understand there are consequences to color, and so color blindness, color muteness doesn't allow us to address that, right? Not just with regard to terrorism, with regard to a whole lot of stuff, and I'm going to come back to that point. But what I really want to talk about with you this evening is this notion that even when we do talk about race, because sometimes we do talk about it, a lot of times we avoid it, that was what I was saying a second ago, but a lot of times even when we do talk about it, we really sort of water it down to the point where we don't get to the core of the problem. So that's why the title of the talk is Beyond Diversity, because see, we do a lot of diversity talk. We've been doing that for a very long time. That's not real new, you know. Colleges have been doing it for years. Corporations have been doing it for years. Community organizations, even churches and synagogues and mosques and all kinds of civic organizations have been talking about diversity and how we want to promote diversity and celebrate diversity and all that. We've been talking about that for years. But what does it mean? Because it seems to me that when a term of art becomes so common as the one known as diversity has become, there comes a point where you have to ask, what's the real meaning of that word? If it becomes so common that everybody can use it, even though we're not all on the same page about what needs to happen in regard to it, then that becomes a word that means everything and nothing at the same time. And I'm not real impressed by words that mean everything and nothing at the same time, because it doesn't tell us much about where we need to go. And with regard to diversity, that's what's happened in this country. So it's one thing to talk about diversity. It's another thing to talk about justice and equity and what that looks like. They are not the same. What's the problem with the diversity focus, whether it's corporate America or colleges and universities or high schools or civic groups? Well, a couple of things. First of all, when we talk about diversity in the abstract, which is what we usually do, what we end up doing is putting all the focus and all the attention and therefore all the pressure and the spotlight on the other, right? Those who were different than the norm, whatever the norm may be. So those who were different, we put the spotlight on them and we basically say, hey, we really want you to be part of our thing, right? But we never actually interrogate our thing. We just basically say, yeah, we want more brown faces in this space. We want more people like you to come and be part of us, but we're not going to ask questions about us. We're not going to actually interrogate the thing that we take for granted. We just want you to be more like us. And if you're willing to come and join our thing and be part of our thing, but not change our thing, then we're cool with that. But that's not justice, and that's not equity, and that's not fairness. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So many years ago, it was actually at the beginning of my career as someone going around the country as an educator and talking about this. Back in 1995, I went to Minnesota for the first time. I don't know if anyone here is from Minnesota. Anyone here from Minnesota? There's always there's always one or two. And it's funny, Minnesotans are really earnest people, but they also don't like to brag, so they always do like what you did. They're just like, yeah, I'm here, yeah. You know, they're not ostentatious people. Minnesotans are wonderful. Anyway, so I went to Minnesota for the first time, and I got off the plane in Minneapolis, and I was picked up by these three appropriately liberal white students for whatever that's worth, and it's worth nothing. And they were driving me to the campus at their school, which is like an hour 10, hour 15 away. And they were telling me, oh, we're so excited that you're here for our diversity day. Right? And I remember being scared to death by that comment because I thought to myself, well, now, if you have a diversity day, I think I know what the other 364 days might be like. And I'm a little worried about that. But hey, you know, I'm new to this. I got to pick my fights. You know, I'm not going to make a big deal out of that. So I told them, hey, cool. You know, that's awesome. I'm glad to be here too. And then I said, you know, I want to know some things about your school. So tell me a little bit. What are some things I might need to know that would help me to tailor my remarks for your campus this evening? And I don't think they really got what I was getting at. They were telling me things that are like in the catalog, you know, or now would be on the website, just basic demographic information. What do people major in? How many students go there? How many people live on campus? And I didn't really care about that stuff, right? I stopped them and I said, no, that's not really what I mean. What I mean is, are there any things that I need to know about, like with regard to racism as a problem on the campus, that I could maybe speak to directly? Incidents, for example, that had happened about which perhaps I should speak. And they all looked at me with this sort of wounded look, right? I'd insulted their honor or something. And they all looked at me, and this one said, oh, goodness, no. And they actually did say goodness, no, because, like I said, it's Minnesota, and they're very earnest people. Am I right? Earnest people. And goodness, no. And they said, no, we don't have any racism on our campus. And I thought that was fascinating, right? For a couple of reasons, right? Number one, I'm an anti-racism educator, so I really can't figure out why in the hell you'd bring me in to a place where there was no racism. Seems like a waste of their money and a waste of my time. Now, I had every intention of taking their money and giving of my time, but still, it seemed oddly redundant if they'd already conquered the problem, you know, to bring me in. And I said it just like that, actually, to them, but because they're earnest and, you know, they were just like, whatever, it went over their heads totally. Didn't know that I was actually insulting them, so that was cool. That was the first reason it sort of stunned me, right, was that why would they bring me in? But the second reason it sort of took me back a minute was I thought to myself, well, how in the world would you know that, right? How would you as white folks know whether racism was operating on your campus? Because it just seems to me that we're not usually the best determiners of that social truth, just like when men tell me there's no sexism. Okay, sure. Right. Of course there's not, and we would know that because we just would, right? Right, when straight folks tell me there's no heterosexism or homophobia, of course not. Why would there be that? And we would be in the best position to know and to make that call because we obviously, as straight folks, would be on the lookout for that. Yes, it makes sense, right? And I said it just like that, and once again, you know, seemed odd to me, but they insisted. I said, well, how would you know? And they said, well, there's this thing we have. Really? You have a thing that gets rid of racism? That is amazing. They're like, oh yeah. Earnest, like I said. Oh, yeah, we got this thing. I'm like, well, what is it? Because I'm thinking to myself, hell, I'm going to Michigan in a week. I don't think they got it. I was living in New Orleans at the time. I knew we didn't have it. I was from Tennessee. I'd never seen it there. It's like, y'all got a thing? I need to get that. Y'all sell it at the airport? Because I will pick it up and put it in my bag and take it with me, right? And market it, right? And I said it just like that. And once again, nope, nothing. They said, no, really, we have a thing. I said, what is it? They said, well, it's this thing that it's like our cultural norm. It's like our slogan. It's like our motto. It's like our way of life. It's this thing we call Minnesota nice. Yeah, you know, you're nodding. Minnesota nice. Everybody that's been in Minnesota for a minute has heard that, right? Minnesota nice. I'm like, what is that? Because I'd never heard of that. It's the first time I've been in the state, you know, and this one individual said, well, it's sort of like the golden rule. You know, you just treat people the way you want to be treated. I said, really, that works? Because that has been around forever. And that has never, ever gotten rid of racism any other place. But you're telling me that here, in this somewhat Scandinavian, incredibly cold environment, that thing has gotten rid of racism. How does that work? Once again, they didn't have much of an answer for me, so I decided I would drop it. Because I figured if I kept pushing them, they would eventually figure out that I was being cynical. So I decided the best course of action would be for me to ask people of color about this thing called Minnesota Nice. And so I had the opportunity over the course of the next several months to go back to the state a couple of times. And when I did, I made a point of sitting down with folks who were activists in communities of color, both black communities, Latino communities, Southeast Asian communities in the Twin Cities, indigenous Native North American communities, and asking leaders in those communities about Minnesota Nice, asking them, well, what do you think about this? And every single time they had the same answer. They all rolled their eyes first. And I don't mean like just like passively rolled their eyes. I mean the kind of eye roll that like you can hear the eyeballs rolling around in the socket, that kind of eye roll. And they all said, oh, Minnesota Nice is killing us. I said, really, tell me about that. They said, yeah, there are two problems with it. Number one, we don't trust it. We've caught plenty of people who are outwardly very civil, right, who talk about us behind our back, who undermine us on the job or at the college, you know, so we just can't trust it. You can be outwardly very nice and kind and still be working against the interest of equity. So we just think it's passive-aggressive behavior half the time. But the bigger problem, they said, was, look, if you're us and you're in an institution where you feel marginalized for whatever reason, and you want to do something about your marginalization, you have to raise your voice, don't you? You have to complain, you have to criticize, you have to protest in some way, shape, or form. And when you do that, you're the one that gets pegged as not nice, right? As in, there was no problem here until you brought race into the room. There was no problem here until you brought oppression and inequality into the room. And so once you get pegged as not nice, they no longer really want you. And so that's when I began to realize the diversity conversation was inadequate, because what these nice white liberal kids were telling me, and I believe that they were sincere. This is what makes it so incredibly disturbing. They were sincere when they talked about wanting more diversity at their college. They weren't lying. They weren't being disingenuous. They really meant that. They would love, I think, to have had a more diverse institution, but only insofar as that diversity would fit within the confines of what they took for granted as a cultural norm. Minnesota nice. But if it was going to be people of color who were going to come and say, actually, this thing y'all think is nice is not so nice to us. This thing that y'all think is good and actually empowering and fun and cool actually feels marginalizing to us. It feels oppressive to us. We don't want any part of it. Then all of a sudden, they would be the problem. So it was only diversity within the confines of the dominant cultural norms. That is to say, what we end up doing too often is we say, yeah, y'all come be part of us. But don't ever forget that we are the sun and y'all are just the planets that go around us. But don't ever question the sun, you see. The sun is the sun. The sun is the giver of all life. And we will determine the norms in our institution. What are the institutional norms that we sometimes take for granted that we need to think about? Because again, I think that's the issue. We don't think about them. We take them for granted. We don't realize that the things that we might assume are normative and fine aren't that way for everyone. Let's think about the labor market for a minute. Let's think about the fact that even if we assume that overt racial discrimination has been diminished over the last 40 years, and I'm willing to countenance that argument for a second, even though I think there's plenty of studies which suggest that even overt discrimination is still quite prevalent. But for the sake of argument, let's just start with the assumption that that really has diminished, that people have become, generally speaking, somewhat more enlightened and are not nearly as ready to blatantly discriminate as they would have been 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. For the sake of argument, let's assume that. What difference does it make when the New York Times tells me, as it did 7 weeks ago, in a big article that was unfortunately not the recipient of as much attention as it should have been, but a big article in the New York Times which said what? That this study had found that about half of all new jobs in the economy, particularly at the quote-unquote best companies, right? That about half of the new jobs were being filled not by objective qualifications, not by open competition, but by referrals made by pre-existing employees of those companies. Referrals for their friends or their family, people in their neighborhood, people they knew, people they went to church with, etc. Right? Now I want you to think about the implications of this, because we take this for granted, don't we, in this culture? We take the notion of networking for granted. We've got entire social networking platforms created not just for like young folks to, tweet and do Facebook and Instagram and all that. We've got like LinkedIn and all these that's about networking. It's about connecting. It's about actually taking advantage of your connections, not necessarily your objective skill set. It's about who you know, not what you know. We all know that's there, but here's an article 7 weeks ago which tells us it's not just networking in the abstract. It's specific referrals from friends and family who are already in the pipeline. Now, you may say to yourself, well, what's the big deal? And I guess in theory, it's not a big deal, because in theory, we might have that same practice in any market economy that was hyper-competitive, and I understand the logic of it. I get why companies do it. I get the economic logic. It's cheaper, isn't it? It cuts down search costs, doesn't it? Because if I can just rely on referrals, it doesn't take as much time to find the next employee, and I can probably make a pretty educated guess that if Jim over there in accounting is a good employee and does a good job, that anybody Jim's likely to refer is probably also going to work out okay. That's probably a reasonable assumption. Jim probably hangs out with people who are competent just like he is, so I get it. But do we understand the implications of that norm? Do we understand what happens when we rely on that for the sake of economic logic or anything else? Who are the people who get disproportionately excluded from those opportunities? They're going to be people of color. They're going to be women of all colors. They're going to be working class folks of all races and ethnicities, right? Because they're not as likely to be in the pipeline if the folks who were already in the company are disproportionately of a monocultural background, even if not one of them was a bigot. Even if not one of them was a racist or a sexist or a classist in any overt sense, the outcome of that process might still be the same as if all of them were, right? Because ultimately, as that New York Times article found, about 70%, upwards of 70% or more, of all the people who get hired through that process are same race of the people who are doing the referral. And that's not because of overt racism. It might not be because of racism at all in any real sense, right? It just might be because who do we live around? Who do we know? Who do we socialize with? The research tells us that like 85% of white Americans live in neighborhoods with almost no people of color around. So even if not any of those white folks were racist in any real sense of the word, if they don't know people of color, they're not able to refer people of color, and so the perpetuation of inequality continues. That's a norm that we don't interrogate. And we don't interrogate it at our peril, not only because it means unequal opportunity for people who might in fact be the best person for the job, but also because it actually hampers the ability of those companies and institutions to find the best employees. It actually doesn't serve their needs either in the long run, right? Because by not casting the net wide enough, you actually cut in half, at least, if not more, the potential pool of applicants, unless you actually believe that the odds are good that the next best employee just happens to be buddies with the last guy you hired, which is pretty unlikely. You would have to assume this is not a really good practice, but it's cheap and it saves money, and so it's a shortcut and it's easy, but it perpetuates inequality. Talking about diversity doesn't do anything if we don't deal with that, right? Same thing is true, and this is why, by the way, I should point out before I move on. This is probably the number one reason why there's such a disparity in the distribution of job opportunities across racial lines. So that right now, for instance, black folks with a college degree are almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be out of work. Latinos with a college degree are about 50 to 60% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans with a degree are about 1/3 more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work, right? And it's not necessarily because they're the victims of overt discrimination. I mean, some might very well be. There certainly is some research to suggest that. But the point is, these disparities could just as easily be happening because of the disparate networks that are the legacy of a history of racial inequality in terms of housing, where people live, where they go to school, who they know, who they went to college with, who they associate with and socialize with. It might be very benign in the sense of any overt prejudice, but the outcome is not benign. And people of color, when they think of racism, that's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about outcomes. The problem is those of us who are white, we're looking for intent. That's what the research tells us, right? A lot of the times we don't think it's racism unless I meant to hurt you. So like if I tell a racist joke but I didn't mean to offend you, oh, I'm sorry you got offended. What kind of apology is that? I'm sorry that you got offended, right? Or if I say something that's racist and if I didn't mean to injure you, right, then it's not really a problem. So if you have these parties on college campuses, this happens every year, usually 5-6 times a year, right, where white students on college campuses put on blackface, makeup, put on gold chains, walk around with 40-ounce bottles of malt liquor, having what they call a ghetto party. They don't think that's offensive. We didn't mean to offend you. We had no idea it was going to be offensive. Now, aside from the ridiculousness of actually not realizing how offensive that is, I mean, it's sort of hard for me to buy that. But even if I buy it, right, what difference does it make what my intent was if someone gets hurt? See, injury is never injury from the injurer. It's only injury from the perspective of the injured, right? No rapist ever thought he did anything wrong. But the women who have been violated by those rapists and the men who occasionally are as well, they actually know there was an injury. The fact that the perpetrator didn't see it really doesn't matter. If I am in a cafeteria lunch line and step on your toe and break it, you don't really care, do you? Whether I woke up this morning in my hotel in Ann Arbor, Michigan and said to myself, oh, I'm going to break some toes today. My intent is not the thing that you're looking for to determine whether I'm actually guilty of perpetuating an injury, right? We got to look at the outcome of things, not just the intent. In a legal sense, the intent might matter in a court of law. We're not talking about legal jurisprudence here. We're talking about philosophically, socially, morally, ethically understanding racial disparity and inequality. It's not just the job market, though. The educational system is the same way. Think about this, right? Putting aside whether there are any racist teachers out there at all, any racist principals in the K-12 system. I mean, let's just say for the sake of argument that there weren't any. And I don't believe that, by the way. But let's just say for the sake of argument, there are no actual racists in any formal sense, in any real blatant sense in our school systems. But we have a school system, do we not, that perpetuates racial inequality and not in a way that can really be thought of as accidental, to be honest. Think about this. We live in a society where we actually, not only do we have a profoundly unstandardized school system in our society, we actually brag about that, right? We're actually proud of it. We're proud of the fact that we don't have centralized planning for schools. My God, we don't want big government picking our curriculum and setting the standards and doing all the funding. We like local control. We like having thousands of independent school districts with wildly disparate resources, and we call that a good school system, even though every country against which we compete does it exactly the opposite way. And has a highly centralized system where the funding is largely centralized and the standards are largely centralized. But by God, we're so afraid of tyranny that we'd rather have local people, because you can't have local tyranny, only federal tyranny. So by God, we're going to have local school. You could teach whatever you want at the local level. You want to teach that the sun revolves around the earth? Okay. That's fine, because we wouldn't want the government setting science standards, right? Even though every other country sort of does that, and you sort of see the results of what they do as opposed to what we do, but whatever. We're proud of our unstandardization, but then here's the problem. So we spend 12 to 13 years, K to 12, 13 years, unstandardized, sending kids to unstandardized schools with unstandardized curriculum, unstandardized funding, unstandardized teacher training, coming from unstandardized neighborhoods, unstandardized families in terms of resources, and at the end of that, we give them a standardized test. 13 years of deliberate inequality that we not only acknowledge but brag about, and then we say, here, take this test and let us know if you learned this stuff that we didn't even teach you. And then we're shocked when they don't actually know the answers to the questions that we never taught them. And then we say, see, you're not prepared to go to college, or at least not this college, maybe this one, but not that one. And we call that justice. We actually have a system that's predicated on that, whether it's based on overt racism or not, right? Right, we do that. That's anybody that's an educator knows most of the standardized tests that we give beginning in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, are what are known as norm reference tests. What's a norm reference test? It's a test where it's not about how much you know in the abstract, right, in terms of the actual material that you've been taught. It's about what you know relative to somebody else who took the same test. So in other words, in a norm reference test, by definition, 50% of the test takers have to score in the bottom half of all test takers, no matter how many of the questions they got right. And 50% of the test takers have to score in the top half, no matter how many of the questions they got wrong. 10% in the top 10%, 10% in the bottom 10%, et cetera. In other words, by definition, 50% have to fail in order for the test to be considered successful. Think about that. Failure as evidence of success. Now, that's not the only way you can test people. You can do what are called criterion reference tests, right, which are the kind of tests that you take in a normal classroom where the teacher teaches you the material and then you have a final exam, and theoretically everybody could score 100 because everybody could theoretically learn the material. And if everybody scored a 100, they'd all get A's, and it wouldn't be, oh, well, half of y'all are in the bottom half. No, everybody would get an A. But we don't do that in the larger systemic sense in our schools. We actually have a system that's predicated on the notion of inequality deliberately, on segmenting people deliberately. Why do we do it? Well, maybe it's about racism, but maybe it's not. I will tell you this much, I think it's pretty obvious why we do it, regardless of whether it's deliberate racism. I think it's because we have a labor market that's predicated on inequality, and you've got to slot people in to that system. What do I mean by that? Real simple. Here it is, bottom line. If everybody goes to college, who's going to pick up the garbage in my neighborhood on Wednesdays? If everybody goes to college, who's going to change the bedpans at the hospital? If everybody goes to college, who's going to change the sheets at the hotel where I'm sleeping this evening? We have a system that's predicated on the idea that those of us with college degrees, we're too good for that work. That's why we went to college, right? So we didn't have to do that work because that's beneath us somehow, even though that's the most important work that gets done in this society. You want to actually talk about the most valuable work that gets done in this country? It's those men that pick up that garbage every Wednesday in my neighborhood, because if they don't come for like 5 weeks, if they just decide to hell with this, y'all pay us $21,000 a year, we're done. We're striking for like 5 weeks. Good luck, y'all. We are screwed in my neighborhood. I don't know where the dump is, where the recycle place is. Hell, we will have bubonic plague on my block. That's how valuable those men and the service that they provide for very little wages and no real benefits or protections, that's how valuable that is. But we pay them like nothing. Meanwhile, 3 doors down, there's a pharmaceutical sales rep, makes 6 figures selling Viagra. Okay. Now, if he doesn't show up to work for 5 weeks, I understand, some people will be upset. I get it. But now here's the deal. Life will go on. In fact, they'll find somebody else to sell the Viagra. It will get sold. It will get distributed. It will get taken. Life will go on. He could go out of town for like 6 months. The world wouldn't change. He could go on strike, quit his job, drop dead tomorrow. Not that I want him to. He's a nice guy. But honest to God, like, the service that he provides to this society is nothing compared to what those individuals or the men and women who take care of old folks in nursing homes, because we dump them in those places in this society. Those are some of the most valuable people we have in this country. We pay them $18,000 a year on average, $19,000, $20,000 a year. It's got nothing to do with merit, nothing to do with the utility that you provide. It's everything to do with whether you can monetize the product that they create. And so those men who pick up the garbage, it's hard to put a dollar figure on that, isn't it? Because you can't sell the garbage. So if you can't monetize it, you can't market it. Like, I don't even know how to price it in the free market. But that Viagra, oh, people pay good money for that, you see. I don't know how to monetize my great-grandmother in the nursing home. I don't know what to do with her. How do we put a value on her life when she only has a few years left? My goodness. Well, you know, now on the other hand, I'll just tell you right now, if old folks started crapping diamonds right before they died, I'm pretty sure we'd pay elder workers like a CEO, right? Just for the purpose of the diamond harvest, right? We'd pay them real good just to make sure they got all the diamonds. I know that's a visual y'all didn't want, but just saying, it's worth thinking about, right? We have a society that's based not on some objective value that you provide to the community, but what can be monetized. So therefore, we have to have an educational system that fits that market system. And if the system of economic and labor market distribution is skewed in that way, then the school system will be too. So whether or not it's deliberate racism or not, if we have that kind of inequality built into the system, who do you think is going to come out on the bottom of that? Disproportionately, and who's going to come out on the top of that, right? When we have schools where white students attend that are 2 to 3 times more likely to be taught by the most qualified, most experienced teachers, and black and Latino and indigenous students 2 to 3 times more likely to be taught by the least experienced teachers, right? Students of color half as likely to be in an honors or an advanced placement class. White students 2 to 3 times more likely to be in those classes. White students half as likely to be suspended or expelled from school. Black and brown students twice as likely to be suspended or expelled from school, even though the research, years of research now tells us that there is no statistically significant difference between the rates at which white, black, and Latino students actually break serious school rules, contrary to popular perception and stereotypes. So is that about overt racism? I don't know. In some cases, perhaps. But even if there wasn't a single overt racist in that system, if the outcome of that system is racial disparity, then that's what we've got to focus on. And making our schools more diverse won't change that. You can have a very diverse, a very well-funded apartheid system, I suppose, where everybody, might go to the same school, but then they're put into different sides of the school. I went to integrated schools in Nashville, Tennessee from 1974 to 1986. I was a member of the first graduating high school class in 1986 to have been fully deseged all the way down to first grade. That lets you know how recent real desegregation is in this country, because they started it in 1971 at the high school level, 72, at the junior high level, 73, in middle school or 5th and 6th grade, and 74, the year that I started, in first grade, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. So I was the first graduating class to have been fully integrated in any real sense of the word, but that didn't mean that was an equitable system. We went to the same schools, we hung out on the same playground, we ate in the same lunchroom, but at the end of the day, when you looked at those honors classes, those advanced classes, versus those remedial classes, they were highly disparate. Is it because the teachers were overtly racist? I don't know, but I do know that there was apparently the belief that certain kids were capable of more. Maybe it was based on an honest belief in that, rather than some type of bigotry. Maybe these teachers actually believed that some of us were more capable than others, but if those beliefs are themselves the result of implicit internalized racial biases, then that's what we've got to concern ourselves with, not bad intentions. And this is something that we have to get our head around, because too oftentimes we assume that because we're good people, and I think we mostly are. I think most people are good people. I think most teachers are good people. I think most employers are good people. I think most of your neighbors are good people. I just think most folks are good folks, and I could be wrong about that. But I've got a 9 and an 11-year-old child, and so I have a vested interest in believing that most people are good. Because if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't have been so apt to want to help bring them into the world, So if you have evidence that I'm wrong about my optimism about the human family, please keep it to yourself, because I don't want to know. I assume people are good, but the problem is good people sometimes miss these things, right? Because we're so busy being good and wrapped up in the fact that we have good intentions, we miss the signs that we're implicated in inequality. In fact, sometimes it's even worse to be a good person in that mix, because sometimes good folks really don't want to look at the ugly, right? See, sociopaths don't care. That's why they're sociopaths, right? So if you're a sociopath, you'll look at the ugly, you'll look at pain all day long. That's what makes you a sociopath. You don't mind it. You're like, hey, you're in pain? Good, I'm a sociopath. Doesn't bother me. But those of us who are good, caring, compassionate people, right, we don't want to look at it because it reminds us of our obligations to do something. And then it's like, oh God, I don't want to see that. I don't want to deal with that. Right? I certainly don't want to be told that I'm somehow implicated in it. But if we're not challenging these norms, the standards that we take for granted, then a lot of times we end up perpetuating injustice. And sometimes it's just about thinking critically about the things that we take for granted. So for instance, a couple of years ago, I was doing a training with an insurance company in Bermuda that had recently had a hiring decision. And Bermuda, I'm not going to give you the whole background on Bermuda if you don't know much about the island, but it's a majority black nation. It has been since the 1830s, but the economic power in Bermuda is still very much in the hands of white-dominated corporations, the insurance companies, the reinsurance industry, a lot of expats from Great Britain and from Canada and the U.S. And so the economic power and the political power are quite different in Bermuda. But anyway, so I was there doing this training with a medium-sized reinsurance company, and they were telling me this interesting story that I think points out the kind of thinking we've got to move toward if we're going to have real equity, as opposed to just diversity. This is a company that's, not bad record in terms of diversity. They've done all right, but there was this one particular decision they had just made. They just had a hiring decision like a month or two before I was there, and they were admitting to me that they think they might have screwed up, Because what they said is, well, we had this hiring decision we had to make, and at the end of the day, the two finalists for the job was one white woman, one black woman, and both were native Bermudians, so there was no difference there. But they said, when it came time, these were people who were getting, it was like a insurance adjuster position or something, and there's a test that they have to take in the final round of consideration. It's like a 20-question test, and it's essays, and you have to write like a paragraph or two or whatever. And it's basically, giving you situations that might emerge on the job and asking you what would you do kind of stuff, right? And so and it's a timed test. I don't remember how much time they had, maybe an hour and 20 minutes or whatever. So they gave the test to the white woman and the black woman. At the end of the day, they said, what happened was the white woman she got through the test. She finished the test, all 20 questions. And the black Bermudian woman only finished about 14 of the 20 questions. But what ended up happening was that the black woman who finished 14 questions got 13 of them right, so she had done really well statistically. And the white woman, even though she got through all 20, had only gotten 15 right, so she'd missed 5, right? So now they're faced with a conundrum, right? Because how do you evaluate merit, right, when you've got 2 possible ways of interpreting merit? And usually you have more than 2. I mean, there are lots of them, but here are 2 very obvious ones, right? So here's a company trying to do the right thing, trying to figure out, well, what do we do? Like on the one hand, efficiency is important. So being able to finish the test, being able to get your job done, that's a value that we want to promote. So maybe we go with her. On the other hand, accuracy for an insurance adjuster is also really important. So maybe we go with that one. You can make an argument for either one of these, I think. I think you could make a merit-based argument for either one, but ultimately it's not real clear-cut, is it? It's the kind of thing we have to really ask ourselves. At the end of the day, they hired the white woman. They rewarded the efficiency over the accuracy, and it turned out this employee didn't work out for them. Didn't end up being as good as they'd hoped. Now, that doesn't prove that their decision was racist. That's not at all. And they said, was it a bad decision? I said, well, I don't know if it was, it clearly didn't work out, so it was bad in that regard. I said, it's not about being racist or not, though. What it is about saying you got to ask these deep questions like, why do some people in that situation perform better on the test than others in terms of efficiency? Why is it that the white woman finished and the black woman didn't? You made the assumption it was because she wasn't as qualified. Maybe she wasn't as sure of herself. Maybe she was nervous. Maybe that suggested she wasn't as qualified. And what I told them was, you've got to be aware of the research. Again, this means being color conscious. What does the research tell us about why that might have happened? Why the white woman was able to finish without any problems even though she missed 5 questions, and why the black woman took longer and ran out of time. Because there are reasons for that have nothing to do with merit or ability, have everything to do with the racial dynamics of identity and discrimination. Because there's a whole body of research out there that actually finds that when you're a member of a stigmatized group, that is to say, people of color, racially, women in terms of gender, low-income folks in terms of economics, right? That when you're a member of a stigmatized group against which there are a number of stereotypes, when you sit down to compete, like on a test, particularly a really high-stakes test, like a standardized school test, or in this case, a job test, against someone from a dominant group who's not stereotyped that way, the anxiety that is created by that dynamic is enough to actually derail your performance and make you underperform relative to your ability. There's 25 years of research on this that finds that people of color, for instance, oftentimes underperform, don't finish the test on time, or they miss too many questions, or they take too long because they're trying to be absolutely sure they've got it right, not because they aren't qualified and capable, but because they're so afraid that if they screw up, if they underperform, it's going to be viewed through the lens of a group defect, right? In other words, they don't get to fail as individuals. Just like brown folk don't get to explode bombs as individuals, right? They end up representing the whole group, whereas white folks, that white woman could take that test and know that even if she missed questions, like no big deal, like nobody's going to think it's because white Bermudians are incompetent, because that's not a stereotype. But that woman of color is thinking to herself, man, I got to get this right. Because and that may be conscious, it may be subconscious. The research says sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, sometimes it's both. Right? But the idea is that when you're up against a stereotype, the stereotype threat, as it's called, or the stereotype vulnerability, is sufficient to actually sometimes make you underperform relative to your abilities. Now, if I'm an employer and I don't know that, or if I'm an admissions officer at a college or a law school or a medical school or a graduate school, and I don't know about that research, I might end up making a really bad decision, rewarding what I think is competence and punishing what I think is relative incompetence, rather than understanding all the social dynamics that go into play that determine how someone does on a test or how someone does in a high-stakes competition. On the other hand, if I am aware of that research, I can train my HR folks, I can train my admission staff, I can train my faculty, I can train whoever's in a position to evaluate others to understand, hey, be aware of all these factors that sometimes go into how people perform. and understand what that means. And what the research tells us is that precisely for those people of color and women of all colors who are sort of upwardly mobile and have really high aspirations and are trying to do well and are trying to move up, they're the ones who are most vulnerable to that stereotype threat because they have the greatest interest in disproving the negative stereotype, right? I'll give you an example from my own life about this, and I'm just about done, and I'll take a few questions if you've got some. But this story is important because it speaks to how this works even for incredibly capable people of color. When I was in college, freshman year, I wasn't a really good student, mostly because I just didn't really try as hard as I should have. But my freshman year at Tulane, I made two really awful mistakes right around the time of final exams. First, I showed up late to one test 2 hours in, and weren't supposed to be allowed into the room if you showed up late, but the teacher did. He was nice enough, he let me in, and I did okay. The other one was bigger, though. I actually showed up at 1 o'clock for a final exam that was given at 10 in the morning. And you can imagine what that felt like. I was sitting there in the room looking around thinking to myself, well, I don't know how these other fools are, but I don't think they're going to do very well. After all, I haven't seen them in class all semester. And they were thinking the same about me. I don't know who this fool is, but I don't think he's going to do very well on this chemistry exam because he hasn't been in here all semester. It was a political science exam, not chemistry, right? It was given at 10. It was over at 1. So now here I was. My class was done. I finally, after an entire 3 months of sitting in the class, decided I would look at the syllabus and realize when the test was actually given. So I panicked, and I ran up to the professor's office because this was my major. I mean, I'd already declared freshman year. I knew what I wanted to major in, and I was panicked because I thought, man, if I flub this, I'm screwed. I'm going to lose my scholarship. I'm going to have to take an incomplete, maybe start college all over, maybe transfer. I can't move on with an F or something in my first year. And so I run up to the professor's office and I'm crying, man. I'm just like a mess, hyperventilating. And he can tell that I'm sincere. It's not like I was just, studying for an extra 3 hours. I was obviously really distraught. And I begged him, right? I said, hey, can I please take the test right now, just like in an office somewhere? Can I just sit down and take it? And he was a good guy, really nice guy. And he said, of course, get yourself together, get some water, compose yourself, go sit in that room. I'll bring you the test in 5 minutes and I'll let you take it. So that was great, and I ended up taking it, and I did fine. But when I told friends about this afterward, and I told a group of friends that some of them were white, some of them were black, the black folks that I told this story to, every one of whom, by the way, were better students than I. They had had better test scores, they had had better grades, they had been better students in high school, they were better students in college. Every single one of them to whom I relayed this incident had a very similar reaction. They all looked at me and they said, wow, I don't know that I would have done that. And I said, what? You mean like screw up and show up 3 hours late? And they're like, no, we definitely wouldn't have done that. Like that goes without saying. That goes without saying. That's not what we mean. They said, no, they all said, we're not sure that we would have gone and asked for the do-over. I said, really? What do you mean? Like you would have just taken the F? You would have taken the incomplete? What do you mean by that? Surely you would have at least tried, right? And they said, well, maybe. They said, we don't know because we weren't in that situation. I don't know what I would have done, they said. But I got to tell you, there'd be that part of us. Every single one of them said this part of us that would have wondered whether or not it was worth the risk. Because if we go to that professor who was an older white gentleman and ask him for the mulligan, in effect, right? Ask him for the do-over, is it possible that he may view us as inadequately prepared because of our race? Like there would be a group stigma put on us that you didn't have to think about, Tim, but we would have had to think about in spite of our academic ability. Like we don't want to be viewed that way, so sometimes it's easier to just walk away. And that was that moment where I came to understand this is not the same world in which we live. See, we think we're living in one united country, or we think that we're working in a company, we're all on the same team, or we're going to a college, we're all on the same team, but we're not experiencing these teams the same way, right? That's why after 9/11, when folks slapped those United We Stand bumper stickers on their car, you actually pay attention to who put those on their car and who didn't. You'll see a pretty vast racial disparity, and it's not because people of color were any less sympathetic to the horror of that day. It's just that people of color know that unity is not something you get just because you proclaim it. You have to work at it. And they knew we weren't a unified country on 9/10, and some terrorists didn't change that the next day. Right? Just like after Boston, there are going to be folks who say we're all coming together as a society, but people of color are waiting for some evidence of that beyond mourning together. Mourning as a society is not the same as uniting to create equity, whether it's in the job market, the school system, the justice system, or anywhere else. And we've got to really think hard about this because the practical implications of not getting it right are enormous. Right? We are looking 25 to 30 years from now. Bottom line, people of color are going to be half the population, white folks the other half. That's the truth, whether you like it or not. Doesn't matter whether you like it. I know there's some folks don't like it. I don't care. I know there's some people don't like it. White folks in Arizona don't like it. I don't care. I've been out there, man. I've seen some of those people that don't like it. The average age is like 137, whatever. So good luck with that. TikTok, you know. It doesn't mean I'm not advocating their death. Don't tweet that now. That's not what I'm saying. I hope they live a long time. I'm just saying, everybody dies. And age is highly correlated with that particular condition of being. That's all I'm saying. So if these folks who keep pronouncing they want their country back, right? That's what they tell you. That's not my words. That's their words. They want their country back. They can't have it. Their country's gone. And thank God for that. New country is emerging, and we must be prepared for it. Now, we can either be prepared for it and hit the ground running to create multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy or not. Right? Either way, they're not going to get their country back, but the question is, what do we do? Because just because the calendar turns and the clock hands move, that won't bring us justice and democracy. Because, 6% of the South African population, white folks, were able to hold on for a very long time and do an awful lot of damage on the way out the door. And so we've got to decide that we're going to proactively try to create this thing. Because if we get 25 years from now when half the population are white and half are people of color, and we haven't diminished the inequities that we see right now, we're not going to survive. That's just it. Right? How do you survive as a productive economy for anybody's kids? I don't just mean black and brown kids, I mean white kids too. How do you survive for anybody if you get to a point where you got half your population twice as likely as the other half to be out of work, 3 times as likely as the other half to be poor, 1/20th the net worth of the other half, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight children, 9 years less life expectancy than folks in the other half? That's not a recipe for social cohesion. That is a recipe for utter social catastrophe, I promise you. If we don't do something about that, that doesn't mean we have to agree on exactly what that is, but we got to get busy thinking about something. Because if we don't address that problem, I promise you 20, 25, 30 years from now, our children and our grandchildren, if we're lucky enough to have them or eventually have them, are going to curse our names. And with good reason, for kicking this problem down the road, passing it on to them, just like our parents and grandparents passed it on to us. Right? We will have handed them a legacy of inequity and injustice that they are not going to be prepared to carry, a weight that is going to be too heavy for them, just like it is becoming too heavy for us. So we have to get busy now, being honest, going beyond diversity, looking at racial inequity, looking at gender and class inequity, and deciding that we are both deserving of better and that we are capable of better. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll be happy to take a few questions, if you have any. I think we've got microphones in the room, so we can run them to you.
Very much for that really important conversation in the home of the good old boys here in Springfield. I'm a little puzzled why you didn't talk a little bit about America's prison population.
Yeah. I'd be happy to address that very briefly. In many of my speeches, I do talk about it quite at length, and so it just depends on the talk I'm giving. I do think that this is one of those arenas in which we can very readily see two things, right? Number one, I believe, is the rather deliberate way in which the incarceration of peoples of color, especially but not exclusively men of color, has proceeded in the last 40 years. But even if it hasn't been deliberate, we can see the effect of a criminal justice system that does not take seriously the need to address racial disparity on the back end, whether or not it's intentional. So what I mean by that are the following things. For instance, if you look at the data from, and this is why I say it has to be, in my estimation, somewhat deliberate. If you look at the data in 1964, you will note that 2/3 of all persons incarcerated in the United States at that time, the year of the Civil Rights Act, 2/3 of all persons incarcerated, state, local, and federal, were white, and only 1/3 were people of color. By 1994, those numbers had exactly reversed. So just in 30 years, became 2/3 people of color, 1/3 white, and those are still roughly the numbers today. There are only two possible explanations for that change, right? One is that in 1965, white folks woke up from a deep criminal slumber and said to ourselves, oh my God, we've been doing all this crime. We should stop. And then black and brown folks, hearing the news that we had retired from crime, said to themselves, oh my God, we should totally go do that crime thing because they're not doing it anymore, so we'll do it. That would explain it, but of course that's not the explanation. Any criminologist would tell you that's not what happened. What is true is that the share of crime done by whites as a share of all crime didn't really budge in that period. The share of crime done by black folks didn't really budge in that period. The share of crime done by Latinos did go up, but only because the population of Latinos went up. Not enough, however, to justify that spike. So the only other possible explanation is that the resources of the justice system after 64 were deployed in a disproportionate way. And of course we know that's what happened. That's what happened especially with regard to the war on drugs, so that right now, for instance, black and Latino folks anywhere from 5 times more likely to 9 times more likely than white folks to be incarcerated for a drug possession offense, even though there is no statistically significant difference between the rates of drug use and thus possession between white folks, Latinos, and black folks, again, contrary to popular belief. All these groups use drugs, sell drugs, possess drugs at roughly the same rates. Black and Latino folks 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated depending on which state you're talking about. Black youth and Latino youth 48 times more likely to be incarcerated for a first-time drug possession offense than white youth, even when all the other factors surrounding the crime, like whether or not there was violence involved, whether or not a gun was present, even when all those factors are the same, black and brown youth 48 times more likely to be incarcerated on a first-time drug offense than comparable whites. So I have to assume that either that's deliberate or it's the result of an amazing ineptitude on the part of law enforcement officials. And either way, it doesn't matter because the outcome is the same. I think it's pretty unlikely that it's coincidental. I mean, why would that happen in 64? Why all of a sudden would the numbers change? Well, what happens in 64? The Civil Rights Act is passed, so you lose one mechanism of social control, one way that you can keep people in check. You got to come up with other ways. And I'm not saying this like conspiratorially. I'm just saying any sociologist will tell you there's this theory in sociology called functionalism, right? And that functional theory is about saying the reason things happen is because it's functional for those in power. So in other words, we know standardized tests don't really measure ability, but they work for the people who've had the best education, so we keep them. It's functional. It's not conspiratorial. It works for the ones who count. And incarceration of people at the bottom works for the ones who count too, because then they can employ them once they're in prison to do stuff that they don't have to pay them real wages for. And so we've got inmates doing work for private companies. We've got inmates in private prisons making profit for shareholders. We've got inmates who are essentially economic benefits to people. In the state of California, every piece of furniture that's made for a state institution, whether it's an office, whether it's a state agency, whether it's a college or university, is made by inmates for like 20 cents a day, as opposed to paying unionized workers on the outside in the free world what they would get paid for doing the same work. So this has become incentivized, and it becomes a mechanism of social control. Or it's an accident, but the outcome is the same. Or it's just stupidity. Maybe the case is that the NYPD's stop and frisk policy, which has stopped 2.8 million between 04 and 09, stopped and frisked 2.8 million New York folks in the city of New York, 88% of whom were black or brown, less than 6% of which were given any kind of citation or arrested because 94.5% had not done anything, which means this is really stupid law enforcement, because if you're stopping people and you're wrong 94.5% of the time, like I could do a better job just rolling a ball down the street in Manhattan and seeing who it hits. Like I could just throw darts at people and have a better odds than that, but they keep doing it, right? Less than 2% of the people they stop have drugs on them, less than 0.2% have a weapon, even though that was the rationale for stop and frisk, was getting guns off the street. It hasn't done that because it's not what they're finding. So why is it? Well, either the law enforcement mechanism is totally inept, or there's some other purpose being served by harassing these black and brown folk on the streets of New York. Either one of those conclusions you come to, doesn't matter. The outcome is the same. We have a highly racialized, economically unjust justice system, and that should be one of the major issues that we as a society try to remedy in the 21st century. Yes?
Well, I found in conversations with people kind of about this, starting this up, it's tough to get some of my white friends to understand about the history of America because it's not taught in schools. We learn it from our elders and our grandparents, and we know about the atrocities that aren't taught in school, and so we try to say this, and it's like, I've never heard of that.
Right.
Do you know of any school systems or anywhere in the country where these things are being taught to this end?
Well, I don't know of any school systems per se that are doing a spectacular job of it. I do know of individual schools that do a great job and individual teachers. But usually what ends up happening, particularly in the public system, is teachers end up having to take it upon themselves to do that because sadly, as a country, particularly in the last 10 years, as we move towards standardized testing and everything has to be, measured and tested, and history is not one of the areas that we've put a lot of emphasis on, right? Because that's not one of the areas that you've got these really hardcore standardized tests. So what ends up happening is the standards for history have really diminished, the time spent teaching history. In my home state of Tennessee, you actually have the state considering blending history and geography together just to save time and to save money. And I mean, now there's a way to teach those things in an interrelated way, but that's not what they're talking about. They're just talking about basically cutting budgets and combining them so they can spend more time on the stuff that the exit exams require them to know. So unfortunately, unless you've got some teachers who are particularly conscientious and are prepared to go beyond the standards that are set in the district or the textbooks that are used, right, which means bringing in their own material, the students are going to end up being woefully ignorant about history. You have states like Texas in the last 2 years, for instance, that unfortunately has an outsized impact on the history textbook market and the overall textbook market because Texas has a disproportionate influence based on their size alone and how many students there are. They have a disproportionate influence on what books get used all around the United States because basically if Texas says we're going to use this textbook, whether it's for calculus or whether it's for history or literature, because they have such a market share, that's what books end up getting published and get used around the entire country. And you have a state in the state of Texas that 2 years ago appointed a board to review their history curriculum made up of people who were not historians, right? No history degrees at all among them, but they're self-taught historians, which is to say not historians, right? Right? It's like I'm a self-taught spelunker, but I've never spelunked. So I don't even know what spelunking is, but I'll teach myself, and then I'll die falling off a mountain or something. These non-historians with ideological predispositions against anything they perceive as liberal, who decided to go in and rewrite the textbooks in Texas and therefore have an influence on the whole country. And what they decided to do, for instance, was, and some of this has been stopped or at least blocked a little bit, but not most of it is still in play. They decided, we're gonna minimize the civil rights movement. We're gonna take out Thurgood Marshall. We're gonna because how relevant is he? The lead attorney in Brown v. Board. The first African American Supreme Court justice. Why would we want him in there? But they put Jerry Falwell in, and they put Rush Limbaugh in, and they put Phyllis Schlafly in, and all these new right-wing figures and radio talk show hosts because they're important. But Cesar Chavez is gone. Thurgood Marshall is gone. They've decided to refer to the slave trade as the triangular trade, right? So as not to make it about slavery. Oh, well, there were people and there was coffee and there was sugar. And so we're just it's a triangle. This was all about minimizing the carnage and minimizing the horror. And unfortunately, they had the political clout to get this done. And even though there have been a lot of reports talking about the just ineptitude of this curriculum and how ridiculous it is, it's being used. And so what I think we're going to have to do in individual school districts and schools is we're going to have to see teachers who are brave enough to say, I'm not going to teach this nonsense, inaccurate nonsense that I'm being asked to teach. Now that may be history curriculum, that might be teaching to the test. Right now there are some very brave teachers in Seattle, Washington who a couple months ago made the news because at 2 or 3 of the high schools there, they just said we're not going to administer these ridiculous standardized tests that you've told us to administer. They tell us nothing about our students. They tell us nothing about their level of preparation. They tell us nothing about our effectiveness as teachers. We're not going to do it. And if only one teacher takes that stand, they're going to get fired or they're going to get reassigned. But if you got 6 or 8 or 10 or a dozen, what are they going to do to you? They can't fire y'all, and they can't reassign 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 teachers. And so those teachers have taken a stand, and up to this point, that stand is holding. They're just saying, we're not going to do this. We refuse. And I think that's what, that means if I'm a history teacher and I have a conscience about teaching accurate history, I need to bring in, if I got to pay for the books myself, I'm going to bring in the alternative material, or I'm going to send the students to websites where they can get all these different perspectives that maybe otherwise wouldn't be there. That's what good teachers do anyway, but it requires some courage, because right now you're being told not to do that. Don't waste any time except right on the material as we've told you to teach it. So we've got to be creative, and we've got to be courageous, and we've got to be willing to go beyond that which we're told that we should discuss. And we've got to get out of this mode of teaching history as the accomplishments of individual great people. This is maybe the biggest problem of all. It's not just the material we don't teach, it's how we teach the material that we do teach. So for instance, the problem in our history textbooks isn't just that we've left out the accomplishments of people of color by and large except for a handful, or the accomplishments of women except for a handful. It's not just that we've left out the atrocities of the past and the present. It's that even when we do talk about those kinds of things, we do it in a way that's very elitist. That is to say, it's sort of the great man theory of history, and occasionally great women. But basically, it's this notion that there are these individual, really courageous people who've done amazing things. Well, the problem with that is if all you're learning about are these like elite people, whether it's founding fathers, whether it's corporate executives and entrepreneurs, whether it's military heroes, which, let's be honest, that's our history curriculum. It's founding fathers, military heroes, and industrialists, right? If that's all we learn, that ends up disempowering young people, because that actually says to them, there are these really amazing people in history, and you ain't going to be any of them. Founding fathers, too late for that. Industrialists, not likely. And military heroes, probably not either. So then basically what you're saying is you should revere these people who've done these amazing things, but y'all are just average everyday people and you can't do anything. When in truth, the biggest improvements in our social history have been the result of the work of average everyday people. I mean, the people that fought for and won the 40-hour work week, the 8-hour day, the minimum wage, who fought and won for women's suffrage, who fought and won the civil rights battles of the 1960s, were by and large not these amazing, they were amazing people, but they weren't extraordinary relative to anyone else. Many of them were just average everyday folks. The civil rights movement was not Dr. King and Rosa Parks alone. It was these 18, 19, 20-year-old young people whose names we don't even remember because they haven't been taught to us, who did the really hard work. They did a lot of the inspirational work, but these other folks came behind them. People like Ella Baker, whose story we haven't heard, but she was as instrumental as any in getting those young people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee together in 1960 at Shaw University for that first meeting of SNCC, because she was tired of waiting for the old heads who'd been doing the work for 30 years to get it together. She loved them, she respected them, she was one of them. She'd been at it for decades, but she said, I'm not going to trust the Ministerial Alliance, and I'm not going to trust the SCLC, and I'm not going to trust the NAACP. We got to get this young blood into this movement. And how many of us have learned anything about that? That's usually not there. And so then if I'm 18, 19 years old, or 15, 16 years old, and all I can see are these sort of iconic and older folks who, of course, old pictures make people look even older than they were, right? Because, folks look older in the 60s and the 50s than they do today. Like, Dr. King was 39 when he was taken from us. I'm 44, and he looks like 10 years older than me when he was 28, because people just looked older back then. They dressed differently, they just looked differently, stylistically looked differently, right? And so in a sense, young people look at that and they're like, wow, I could never be like that. When in fact, that was who those folks were those people. In that era, a lot of young folks. So we've got to not just tell the truth about stuff we've lied about, but it's also about the way we tell it. It's the style that we bring to it. It's making history meaningful to people rather than what we do, which is we teach it linearly, right? So we start on this date and we end on this date, and that just automatically means that we teach history as a narrative of constant progress, because linear history essentially encourages you to do that. It's like, well, we had these problems, but some good people got together and fixed them, and thank God we don't have those problems anymore. When in fact, accurate history is not linear, because life is not linear. Our individual lives are not linear, right? We know that every one of us has had setbacks, even as we thought we were doing good and we were making progress and things were going well, and then something bad happened and we got knocked back a couple of steps. That's not linear, right? It's cyclical. It's 2 steps forward, a half a step back, 3 steps back, 4 steps forward, 2 steps back. That's how history has been. And if we don't teach that to young people, then they just easily get the impression that, well, it's all good, give it 20 more years when it's 50-50 people of color and white folks and all this stuff will go away. And I hear that all the time, like, look, when it's 50-50, this can't last anymore because, you know, that's my parents' problem. That's my grandparents' problem. We've got this, you know. We've got it. We hang out with each other. We're cool with each other, all this other stuff, because we've taught that all it takes is the passage of time and not actual work. So it's the content, but it's also the approach to teaching history that we need to work on. A couple other ones real quick. Thank you.
I feel like I have probably 10,000 questions for you.
Where are you?
I'm right here. Sorry.
Oh, okay, cool.
But I picked out two.
Okay.
Earlier you were talking about the criminal justice system, and I was wondering maybe if you would have the same thesis as Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow.
Uh-huh.
And then secondarily, you were talking about sociology. And I was wondering what you maybe thought about William Julius Wilson's analysis of race in America compared with Eduardo Bonilla Silva's.
Compared with what?
Eduardo Bonilla Silva, he's a professor.
Oh, Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Yeah. Well, Michelle first. I know Michelle, and she and I are friends and colleagues in some ways, and have collaborated on a few things. I think her book is brilliant, and I think it's very accurate, and I think most of the criticisms of it are the result of people who haven't really read it or thought clearly about what she is and isn't saying. You know, the idea behind the new Jim Crow is that mass incarceration functions as segregation functioned. She really isn't saying it's exactly the same. That's never been her argument, though that's sometimes what she's accused of. She's saying that it functions in the same way, and that the disproportionate maltreatment of black folks in particular, and people of color more broadly, I suppose, ends up functioning as a mechanism of social control, the outcome of which is very little different from what segregation did. One of the ways in which that's true that she discusses, not the only way, is that, of course, you know, people who have criminal records are in several states of this country disallowed from ever participating in civic life again as voters, and certainly while they're incarcerated or on probation, they're not allowed to in most states, and even after they're out and have paid their dues to society, they're not allowed to in 8 or 9 states, I guess. And the history of that is overtly racist. If you look at the states that passed those disenfranchisement laws, it was at a time during the retrenchment after Reconstruction, during the period of the reassertion of white supremacy, where white lawmakers got together and essentially illegalized blackness. I mean, you had black codes, you had these, debt peonage laws. They could just arrest black people for not having a job, for being vagrant, and then make them go work at a steel mill, or make them go work in a coal mine, or essentially send them back to some of the very plantations from which their families had been liberated. So that was the history of mass incarceration. That was actually the beginning of the prison system. That was the beginning of this whole notion of a criminal justice system. And so she's tracing that out, and she's saying that it functions very much in that way. And I think it's incredibly true. I think that with regard to Bonilla Silva as opposed to William Julius Wilson, a couple things that are important. That is that Dr. Wilson's thesis, and for those who don't know, William Julius Wilson is a sociologist now at Harvard. He began at the University of Chicago, and actually I think he began somewhere else, but he came to notoriety at the University of Chicago in the 1970s when he wrote a book called The Declining Significance of Race. Since then he's written 3 other books, and interestingly enough, his position has shifted. So in the 1970s, his position was, and it was very much outside the mainstream of American sociology, particularly for black sociology, right, was that race really wasn't the issue now, it was class, and the problem was what he called deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing jobs in the cities, the flight of manufacturing, and that was really why black folks had worse economic prospects than white folks. It wasn't racism per se. And he was criticized pretty roundly, and I think for good reason criticized, in the 70s and 80s by scholars who pointed out that, yeah, there was some truth to the deindustrialization thesis, there was some truth to the notion that there was mismatch because the jobs had moved to the suburbs and black folks still lived in the cities, and therefore, but they were pointing out that, the fact that they moved was not racism free. They didn't just leave coincidentally. There was a certain degree to which they relocated because they had these negative views about black workers and black communities. So even when they did move for economic reasons, there were some racial biases that were implicated. And over the years, Wilson wrote 2 or 3 other books, all of which basically said the same thing. But in the 1990s, he and his research team at the University of Chicago, before he made the switch back to Harvard, went out into the Chicago labor market and did these surveys of employers, white employers, where they were asking these questions about why they didn't seem to hire young black men in particular. And the answers they were getting back were very candid and very telling. And what those answers consisted of, basically, were white employers saying that they don't like black men, and they don't trust black men, and they don't think they make good employees, and they were making these generalized arguments about black men, not necessarily based on experience. It wasn't that, oh, well, we hired 7 of them and none of them worked out. It was just based on their prejudices. So Wilson himself and his research team said, wow, maybe the significance of race hasn't declined as much as we thought. Now, since then, he's written another book where he makes the argument that it's still mostly class, but he acknowledges that racism is in the picture. And so I think in that regard, I appreciate that he's moved to that point. I am critical of much of Wilson's ongoing thesis, though, in my book, Colorblind, and I do think that for the most part, Bonilla Silva has the better part of the argument. And for those who don't know Eduardo's work, he's a sociologist at Duke. Bonilla Silva is the one who sort of came up with, well, one of 2 or 3 scholars who came up with the notion of colorblind racism, this idea that the biggest problem nowadays is not sort of deliberate overt racism, but this colorblind racism, by which he means the ability of white folks, including very well-intended white folks, by virtue of ignoring race, not thinking about race, and assuming that those who inject race into the conversation are the source of the problem, that actually is the primary way in which racism and racial inequity is perpetrated, by not discussing it, by ignoring it, by avoiding it, by using these rhetorical narrative mechanisms by which we deflect the conversation onto other conversations, and that notion that we should talk less about it, we shouldn't do deliberate things like affirmative action, we shouldn't make deliberate efforts to include people because that's color conscious and that's racist. All of those things Bonilla Silva is talking about, among other things, as being contributors to racial disparity, and I agree very much with his perception on that. My entire book, Colorblind, is really based on building on that premise that Bonilla Silva lays out and talking about the way in which our politics have moved to a very colorblind place where we're not supposed to talk about these things, we're not supposed to acknowledge them, we're supposed to not do, and the courts have made it very tough for employers and schools to do any kind of aggressive affirmative action by way of court decisions, and I talk about in the book, as he does in his work, about the way that locks in, really cements in place the disparities and the inequalities. So I agree overwhelmingly with Eduardo's work and with Michelle's work. I think Dr. Wilson's work is also beneficial in some ways. I think there is value to his economic analysis, for instance. It's not that William Julius Wilson is wrong, and that Bonilla Silva and Alexander are right. They're all right in various ways, but I think that by and large, the colorblind racism thesis is the more accurate of those two, and that Michelle Alexander's thesis about the justice system is definitely on point and worth folks reading. Do we have time for one more or no? No, we're done. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks.